It seems to me that Russia has burned through a big part of its Soviet era stock of armored equipment in this war, which was one of the big advantages it had. And also it accumulated really significant numbers of killed and wounded. So how much would it be fair to say that when this war ends, or there will be some kind of a pause in the fighting, or the intensity will go down? Would you say that it would be fair to say that Russia will be weaker militarily than it was before, and how much weaker it might be? And another follow-up question to that is, how long, if they would be weaker, how long would it take them to get back to the levels of where they were prior to this war began?
Okay, we're going to try to take that on. I think the honest answer for some of us is we just don't know. But I'll do my best. Trying to predict Reconstitution for someone is challenging because it depends on a great deal of things that you can't really account for, from political and bureaucratic decisions to the economic resources available, right? So if you're asking about basic Reconstitution inputs, my first question is, do you know what the price of oil is going to be for the next 10 years? I don't. That's what biggest factor is determining the resources the Russian government will have available. Do you know what the Russian economy is going to look like a year from now? I don't. I don't think Russia's going to have an economic crisis or catastrophe necessarily this year, but they'll probably have a couple crises they'll have to get through. And increasingly, the sustainability of the war effort from the economic perspective looks quite shaky for them. So hard to account for impact of sanctions on these things. But to answer your question fairly, first, Russia has been burning through Soviet stocks. That's true. And this is probably the last war of not the Russian military, but the Soviet military that inherited, and the Soviet stocks inherited. That's a lot of stocks they consume from storage, they consume to expand the force, not just to lose in this war. And so people are often mistaking. Also, losses in equipment need a couple caveats to them, because like personnel losses often include equipment that's abandoned or damaged, right? And here, I think in open sources, there's two tendencies. One, a tendency to maybe obviously underestimate what the vehicle losses are in terms of vehicles that are destroyed, because there's a lot, you don't see everything, right? You're guessing maybe what's counted in open source is 80% of it, right? But also, I think Russians are able to recover quite a few of the vehicles that are damaged or abandoned too, particularly from some earlier periods of the war. So it depends. Meaning what I'm trying to say is that we have rough estimates, but I don't think we can say for certain we know how much they've lost. That said, they've taken a lot out of storage, and are starting to hit zero in some storage bases or near it in terms of equipment that is serviceable or is worth repairing, because you burn through the part of the inventory that you can put into service first, and eventually you get lots of stuff that can be cannibalized for parts, but these are just holes or, combat modules, but it's not worth restoring that vehicle. I mean, you're much more better off just trying to build an entire new vehicle than trying to put into service. So the way I look at it, I think that on storage, yes, they're burning through their Soviet legacy, and it's going to take them a very long time to try to build up a future reserve, because the Soviet Union is gone and its defense industrial capacity is gone, and even with a high rate of spending, they're not able to replace it. On ammunition stocks is a different story. They've been able to increase production of precision-guided weapons of various types very significantly in the last 3 years. And there, I think they're going to be able to recover the munitions they expended much faster than we anticipated in 2022. On the force itself, the biggest issue is force quality. Look, you can replace material, but it's very hard to replace experienced men, junior officers, and Russia lost the military that it went into the war with in 2022. Now, we can, of course, debate, well, how good was that military, right? Because what's going to come out of this war is a force with hundreds of thousands of men that have combat experience in a real war, instead of whatever it is they went into that clearly had big problems with the fundamentals and training, a lot of gun decking issues, readiness issues, and whatnot. And so I'm just saying you could argue it both ways. I hate to kind of do this, but I debate it with myself. Like, yes, they lost its military, but was that military that great based on what we saw in 2022? Or is the military now that we see going into 2025 a much more capable and experienced force? There's something in between, because you've seen the Russian military degrade in its ability to effectively conduct large-scale combined arms operations. Those maneuver really above the platoon or company level on the ground. But on the other hand, get much better in dynamic targeting, recon strike, recon fire, and realizing some of the concepts that they couldn't effectively employ at the beginning of the war. So there's a duality to it. And it's a challenge with a narrative that, either the Russian military is not adapting and doing very poorly, or they're doing really great and adapting and developing effective counters, and the truth is in between. In some areas it's improved, and in other areas it degraded. I'm sorry, it's not easy to say that the force is just getting better or getting worse or something like this. There's areas of adaptation. Ukrainians and Ukrainian colleagues in this war have a much more sober and, I think, realistic appreciation of Russian military's learning capacity for adaptation than Western colleagues who are remotely viewing this war. That's my overall assessment. And I think that there is a tendency here. That's part of the reason why, at the end of the day, I feel you really have to be there, because you get very outsized impressions and anchoring impressions from what you see of the combat footage posted, and it's not always representative of reality. So when I look at the Russian military, I think in terms of replacing material, it will probably get there quite faster than we thought before. Typically you tend to think in crude terms. Is it 10 years? Is it less than 10 years or more than 10 years? So 10 years is a very short defense planning timeline, right? For folks who don't work on this, 10 years seems like a long time. But in defense planning, 10 years is kind of a minimum planning timeline. It's going to be here around the corner. So I myself debate with it. Probably might be 10 years or less, right? I'm not with the people who claim, look, within 2 or 3 years, we have to be worried about rapid Russian recovery. I'm skeptical of that. But I think 10 years or a bit less is a fair sort of timeline to look at. Lastly, Reconstitution is not about rebuilding the military that Russia had in 2022. That's not going to happen. It's not about replacing the losses that they had either, because they're going to go with a different force structure and a different force composition. It's very clear from this war. So it's facile and pointless to sort of imagine a Reconstitution progress bar, where you and I talk 2 years from now and we say the Russian military is, 76.5% reconstituted. What does that mean? And the answer doesn't mean anything, right? For example, the Russian military decides that they need to have fewer tanks in the force than they had before. And so instead of 3,000 tanks, the force has 2,500 tanks. So does that mean that they've not reconstituted enough, or does that mean that they've made a different assessment on force design, right? Lastly, it's very important to always look at not just what the force has, but what you think it can do. So it will be, again, a challenge to try to assess at what point has the Russian military restored the ability to conduct large-scale combat operations, which we see in Ukraine, but sufficient such that Russia could pose a serious threat to NATO, right? And it's important to differentiate between the notion that, Russia could win a war with NATO, which I don't think Russia can, I don't think Russia could, and nobody was arguing that before 2022 either, to be very clear. Sorry to folks who had who believed that we had an exaggerated sense of Russian military power. Yeah, we did, but there wasn't anybody arguing that Russia could easily win a war with NATO. Although there was kind of a call to arms intellectually done by RAND reports and war games, and we had a lot of debates about that in almost 10 years ago now, when I think about it. There was a big correction in the field and looking through the challenges that we faced in the Baltics, which I think led to a lot of the right decisions on force posture in the region. But that said, to be able to pose a serious threat to a member of NATO where the fight is likely to happen, right, in the region, yeah, I think that we could probably see that in, unfortunately, a shorter timeline than I would have assessed in 2022, based on the losses that Russia suffered in 2022. So I would close that conversation out by saying, bottom line, Russian reconstitution is not an if, it's a debate on when.
If you're enjoying this podcast, chances are that you like to know what's going on in the world of geopolitics. And if that's the case, you might want to sign up to my newsletter. There's a lot of news on geopolitics, but most of it just doesn't actually matter. It's just chasing headlines, emotions, and breaking news. What I want to do is to try to separate all this noise and find the signal, the stuff that actually does matter and will have consequences months and years down the line. And so in every edition, I pick out 3 things that do matter and explain why and what will be their future impact. You can find the link in the description, so check it out and sign up to stay informed.